Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. My name is Ethan Graves, and I live in St. Cloud, Minnesota. I was 24 when this incident happened to me. I had just finished visiting my parents in Mankato and was heading back home after a weekend trip. The drive should have been simple, straight shot along Highway 169. But something strange started happening about halfway into the journey, something that I still struggle to make sense of to this day. It started when I saw the first one, just standing there on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. A clown, you know, the kind with the exaggerated red nose, white face paint, and oversized shoes. It was late, past midnight, and I was the only one on the road for miles. At first I thought it was some kind of prank, college kids maybe. But as I passed, the clown didn't move, didn't even flinch. Its eyes followed me, cold, piercing, as if it could see straight into my soul. The feeling that came over me was more than just unease. It was something darker, something that twisted my gut. I brushed it off, figuring it was just some weirdo looking for attention. But then I saw another one, a few miles further down the road. This time, it was crouched by the guardrail, head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if watching the traffic, or lack thereof. Again, I was alone on the road. No other cars. And as I drove past, it slowly raised a hand in a wave. My heart skipped a beat. I sped up, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. I was starting to get the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. By the time I saw the third one, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. This one wasn't on the side of the road, though. It was standing in the middle of the highway, dead center of my lane. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding in my chest. The clown didn't budge, just stood there, staring straight at me, a twisted smile painted on its face. Its clothes were filthy, stained with something I didn't want to think about, and the makeup looked smudged, almost like it had been crying. But it was those eyes, dark, empty, and unblinking, that froze me in my seat. I honked, hoping to scare it off. Nothing. It didn't flinch. The seconds dragged on, and I felt this overwhelming sense of panic wash over me. I had to get out of there. I swerved around the clown and gunned it, speeding down the highway like my life depended on it. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting it to still be standing there. But it was gone. Just gone. Like it had never been there in the first place. I kept driving, trying to convince myself that it was just some weird coincidence, maybe part of the creepy clown craze I'd heard about in the news. But the nagging feeling in my chest told me something else was going on, something far more sinister. My phone buzzed, and when I glanced at it, I saw an unfamiliar number. I shouldn't have answered it. I know that now. But in my state of panic, I figured it might be a friend or someone calling to check on me. The voice on the other end was raspy, almost like someone trying to speak through a mask. "You're going the wrong way," it said. I slammed on the brakes, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. I looked around, scanning the empty highway for any sign of life. Nothing. I was completely alone. I asked who it was, but all I got in response was this eerie, high-pitched laughter, like the kind you'd hear at a circus, only warped, distorted. The call ended abruptly, leaving me sitting in my car, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored the gas pedal, my car roaring down the highway. But something had shifted. The world outside my window didn't feel real anymore. It felt darker, like the road itself had become a trap. And then I saw it again. Another clown. But this time it wasn't standing. It was running. Full speed. Right at me. I couldn't see its face clearly, but the way it moved, jerky, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't human. It charged at my car, arms flailing, and I swerved to avoid it, nearly losing control. My tires screeched, the car fishtailing as I fought to regain control. When I looked back, the clown was gone. I was shaking, my pulse racing as I sped down the road. I felt trapped, like the highway was a never-ending loop, and I would never make it home. I kept thinking about that call, that voice telling me I was going the wrong way. But what did that even mean? I hadn't changed direction. I was still heading north, still on track for St. Cloud. But the further I drove, the more wrong everything felt. The landscape outside didn't look familiar anymore. It was like the world had shifted, twisted into something unrecognizable. The streetlights flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A flash of color, the unmistakable blur of a clown suit. I don't know how long I drove like that, terrified, paranoid, glancing into every shadow, expecting another one of them to appear. My phone rang again. This time I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much. The call went to voicemail, and a few seconds later my phone buzzed with a notification. Against my better judgment, I checked the message. It was a picture of me. Driving down the highway, the picture had been taken from just behind my car. The clown was in the shot too, its face pressed up against the rear window, grinning right at the camera. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I made it home. I parked my car and ran inside, locking every door and window behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind sent my heart racing, convinced one of those clowns would find its way inside. The next day I checked the car. No damage, no sign of anything unusual. But the memory of that picture haunted me for weeks. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there on that highway, and whatever it wasn't human. It was still out there waiting for its next victim. I never believed in curses until the day I found that box. It was just a regular Saturday morning, one of those rare lazy weekends where I had nothing planned. I was wandering through a small flea market on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where vendors sell everything from rusted tools to vintage toys that no kid would ever want. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just killing time. But then I saw it. Tucked away in the far corner of the market, hidden behind a pile of junk, was an old wooden box. The wood was dark and worn, as if it had seen more than its fair share of years, with intricate carvings spiraling across its surface. The vendor, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a sickly grin, seemed almost too eager to sell it to me. "It's special," he whispered, leaning in closer than I was comfortable with. "Not for everyone, but I think you can handle it." I laughed it off, thinking he was trying to add some mystery to make the sale. For some reason, despite the uneasy feeling gnawing at me, I couldn't resist the pull of the box. It felt important, like it had been waiting for me. I bought it for next to nothing and carried it home, unsure of why I was so compelled to own such a strange, unsettling object. The box sat untouched on my coffee table for the better part of a week. I didn't know what to do with it. At first it seemed like just a decorative piece, albeit an odd one. But every time I passed by it, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like something was watching me. One evening after a long day at work, I decided to finally open it. The moment I lifted the lid, a wave of cold air rushed out, as if the box had been sealed for centuries. Inside were several items: a tarnished silver locket, a small brass key, a folded piece of yellowed paper, and an old cracked mirror, no larger than the palm of my hand. It didn't make sense, they were just objects, things you'd find in an antique shop. But there was something off about them, something that made my skin crawl. I unfolded the piece of paper. The handwriting was messy and uneven, but the words were clear. "Take only one, but know this. The object will choose you. It will bring death." I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things correctly. Death? Was this some kind of sick joke? But the room had grown colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping closer. The first night, I dreamt of the locket. In the dream, I was wearing it around my neck, the cold metal pressed against my skin. I could hear whispers, muffled, urgent voices, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. The whispers grew louder until they were screaming in my ears. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of the voices still echoing in my head. The next morning, the locket was gone. I searched everywhere, but it had vanished without a trace. That's when I realized I hadn't chosen the object. It had chosen me. I didn't want to believe it, but strange things started happening. At first, it was little things. My phone would ring, but there'd be no one on the other end. The lights in my apartment would flicker. Doors that I knew I'd closed would be open when I returned home. Then it got worse. One night, I heard a loud crash in the living room. I ran in, heart pounding, only to find the old mirror from the box lying shattered on the floor. But that wasn't what made me freeze in terror. Standing in the middle of the room, just for a moment, was a shadowy figure. Tall, featureless, and watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I became obsessed with the box, trying to figure out what was happening. I scoured the internet for any information about cursed objects, ancient artifacts, anything that might explain the horror unfolding around me. But all I found were vague warnings and superstitions. Then, people around me started dying. The first was a coworker, Emily. She'd been over at my apartment just a few days before, curious about the box. She had picked up the brass key, joking about what door it might open. 2 days later, she was found dead in her apartment, the cause of death unknown. The police said there were no signs of foul play, but something in her face, frozen in a twisted expression of horror, told me it was anything but natural. Then it was my neighbor, Mrs. Harrison. She'd been a kind, elderly woman, always smiling, always offering to bring me food. She stopped by to drop off a casserole one evening, noticed the box, and made the mistake of touching the mirror. 3 days later, she fell down the stairs in her home, breaking her neck. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The objects in the box were cursed, bringing death to anyone who came into contact with them. And the worst part? I couldn't get rid of it. I tried. I threw the box in a dumpster miles away from my apartment, but it reappeared on my coffee table the next morning, the lid slightly ajar as if inviting me to look inside again. I buried it deep in the woods, but it found its way back to me, dirt still clinging to the edges. I was trapped. The box had chosen me, and it wasn't going to let me go. The deaths continued. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers, anyone who came into contact with one of the cursed objects met a gruesome fate. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was coming from the box. I lay frozen in my bed, listening as the sound grew louder, more frantic. Slowly, I got up and walked to the living room. The box was shaking, the lid rattling as if something inside was desperately trying to get out. With trembling hands, I opened it. There was nothing inside. The objects, the locket, the key, the mirror, were gone. But the box wasn't empty. Inside, etched into the wood at the bottom, was a single word. Soon. I don't sleep much anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, feel the cold touch of the locket around my neck, see the shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. I've become a prisoner in my own home, too terrified to leave, too terrified to stay. The box sits on my coffee table, silent, but ever present, like a ticking time bomb. I know my time is running out. The box has claimed so many lives, and I'm next. It's only a matter of time before it takes me too. But there's one thing I don't understand. One question that keeps me up at night. Who will the box choose after me? There's a reason no one goes to Blackthorn Forest at night. I should have listened. I stood there, staring into the endless shadows, my heart hammering in my chest as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the horizon. The old trail, barely visible through the undergrowth, stretched ahead of me like a dark, twisted invitation. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow, and cursed myself for being so stupid. But it was too late to turn back now. My name is Jake. I'm 28 years old, and I live in a small town just outside the Blackthorn Forest. Growing up, we all heard the same stories, the ones that sent shivers down your spine at campfires. The old folks called it the Screaming Woods, a place where people vanished, where the wind never blew, but somehow screams echoed through the trees at night. No one had ever come back to tell the tale, or at least, no one sane enough to speak of it. Of course, I thought it was all local superstition, until I found myself standing on that cursed trail, drawn by a stupid dare from my so-called friends. I figured a night alone in the woods would prove them all wrong. But now, with the silence pressing in, I wasn't so sure. The air felt thick, like it was waiting for something or someone. I glanced at my phone, a single bar of service, just enough to check the time, 7:45 p.m. The plan was simple: walk into the woods, spend the night, and walk out by sunrise. Easy. But as the light disappeared, so did my confidence. Something about this place felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way the shadows moved, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting for me to make the first mistake. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. I kept walking, trying to push down the rising anxiety. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. My flashlight flickered, and I tapped it against my thigh, forcing the beam to steady. The last thing I needed was to be alone in the dark here. As I moved further into the woods, a low, distant sound caught my attention. A whisper, maybe? Or was it the wind? No, it was something else. Something faint, but unmistakable. A scream. My blood turned cold. It wasn't loud or piercing, more like a far-off wail carried by the night air. I stopped, straining to hear. But the forest had returned to its eerie silence, the only sound my own ragged breathing. "Hello?" I called out, regretting it the moment the word left my mouth. There was no answer. Of course, there wouldn't be. This place wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. Still, I kept walking, convincing myself it was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe it was a distant animal or a trick of sound. But as the minutes ticked by, that uneasy feeling only grew stronger. The trees seemed denser, the air heavier. And then I heard it again. A scream, closer this time. I froze, my skin prickling as the sound echoed through the woods. It was unmistakable now. Someone was out there. Someone, or something. My flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't recover. Darkness swallowed me, thick and suffocating. I cursed under my breath, fumbling with the battery compartment, trying to get the light back on. But no matter how much I shook or hit it, it wouldn't work. That's when I realized the woods weren't silent anymore. Something was moving, slowly, deliberately, just beyond my line of sight. Leaves rustled, twigs snapped, and the air felt alive with tension. I held my breath, trying to listen, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. The scream rang out again, but this time it was different, more distinct, more human. My pulse raced as fear shot through me. I wasn't alone. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, though I couldn't see anything beyond the oppressive darkness. My fingers shook as I reached for my phone, flicking on the weak, pathetic light. It barely pierced the darkness, but it was enough to show me the path ahead. I moved quickly, my heart pounding, desperate to get away from whatever was out there. But then something shifted in the corner of my eye. I turned the light toward the trees and froze. A figure stood among the trees, barely visible in the dim light. Tall, gaunt, with impossibly long limbs, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. Who "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice trembling. No response. For a moment we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. I didn't dare move, my muscles tense and ready to run. But the figure remained still, like it was waiting for something. And then, it screamed. The sound tore through the air, deafening and unnatural, like a chorus of voices crying out in agony. I stumbled back, my ears ringing, dropping my phone in the process. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to grab it, the light flickering wildly as it hit the ground. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, the narrow trail twisting and turning beneath my feet. Branches whipped against my face, but I didn't care. I had to get out. The screams followed me, growing louder, closer. They weren't just one voice anymore. They were many, dozens, hundreds. It was like the forest itself was alive, screaming in rage, in pain, in terror. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours. Time had lost all meaning. The only thing that mattered was escaping the forest, escaping the screams. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Not with those voices behind me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the woods, collapsing onto the grass outside. The screams stopped abruptly, the silence almost as terrifying as the noise had been. I lay there for a long time, gasping for breath, staring up at the night sky. The stars seemed too bright, too distant, as if I had emerged from a different world entirely. My body shook with exhaustion, my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. Eventually, I dragged myself to my feet, glancing back at the dark line of trees. The forest stood silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I never told anyone what really happened that night. Not my friends, not the cops, not anyone. Because even now, years later, I still hear the screams in my dreams. And every time I do, they sound closer. Whatever lives in the screaming woods, it's still out there, watching, waiting. And if you're ever foolish enough to go in, don't expect to come out. At least, not the same. I never believed in the paranormal, ghosts, spirits, demons, just stories people told to scare each other. But that was before I saw something with my own eyes, something that I still can't explain. Now, whenever I step into a basement, my skin crawls, my heart races, and I can't shake the feeling that something is watching from the shadows. If I had known what I was walking into that night, I would have never gone down there. But some things, it seems, are unavoidable. It all started 2 years ago when I inherited my uncle's old house after he passed away. He was a reclusive man, a collector of strange objects and antiques, but his death was sudden and unexpected. No one in the family wanted the place. Too many bad vibes, my aunt had said. But I needed a change, something different in my life, and the house seemed like the perfect project. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house was in decent shape for being as old as it was, but it definitely needed some work. Most of the rooms were cluttered with boxes of my uncle's things, artifacts from different parts of the world, dusty books, and random furniture. The basement, though, that was the one place I avoided. It was dark and musty, the kind of basement you see in horror movies. The light down there flickered and buzzed like it could go out at any moment. I had only been down there once, briefly, to check the breaker box when the power went out during a storm. I barely paid attention to anything down there, except for the strange sensation that made me feel as though I wasn't alone. But I chalked it up to my imagination, just nerves from being in an unfamiliar place. That all changed one Friday night. I had been going through some of my uncle's boxes in the attic when I found an old, heavy iron key. It was rusted, cold to the touch, and unlike any other key I'd ever seen. It was wrapped in a faded piece of cloth along with a handwritten note that simply read, "Do not unlock the basement door." I froze, reading the note again, feeling a sudden tightness in my chest. I didn't even know there was a second door in the basement. The note didn't explain anything further. Who leaves a cryptic message like that and doesn't give more details? Curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and headed down to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, the air growing colder with each step. That smell, damp, old, and something else I couldn't place, filled my nostrils as I descended. My breath felt heavy, like the air was thickening around me. I scanned the walls of the basement, looking for any sign of another door. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Just the same old stone walls and shelves packed with dust-covered objects. But then, at the far end of the room, behind a stack of old crates, I saw it. The door was small, barely tall enough for someone to walk through without ducking, and it blended so seamlessly into the stone that I could have easily missed it. There was no knob, just an iron keyhole, ancient and foreboding. I stood there holding the key in my hand, my heart thudding in my chest. Everything inside me screamed not to open it. But again, curiosity won. The key fit perfectly, and with a click that echoed louder than it should have, the door swung open. A rush of freezing air hit me, colder than anything I'd felt in that basement. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought the batteries might die. I stepped inside, shining the beam of light into the space beyond. It was a room, much larger than I expected, with stone walls that seemed to close in the deeper I walked. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Strange markings were etched into the floor, symbols I didn't recognize. But it wasn't the room that sent a chill down my spine. It was the feeling, this overwhelming sense of dread, like I had crossed a line I should never have crossed. I turned to leave, but the door, now shut, didn't have a handle on the inside. Panic shot through me. I banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. My flashlight flickered again, and I could swear I heard faint whispers coming from the dark corners of the room. I swung the light around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing, only shadows. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. A shadow, darker than the others, moving slowly across the wall. It seemed to shift and morph, like it was crawling along the stone. I backed up, pressing myself against the cold wall, my eyes locked on the shadow as it took shape. A figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and no discernible face. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel something, no, someone, standing right behind me. The flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely. I was plunged into total darkness. My heart pounded in my ears as I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck. I screamed, stumbling forward, feeling my way through the pitch black, trying to find the door again. That's when I heard the voice. Low, guttural, like it was right in my ear. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I slammed into the door, pounding my fists against it, screaming for help. The whispers grew louder, overlapping with each other, filling my head with a noise that was unbearable. And then, just as I thought I would go mad, the door creaked open, and I fell out into the basement, gasping for air. The basement light flickered back on, and the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I scrambled to my feet, running up the stairs, not daring to look back. I locked the basement door behind me and collapsed on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. For weeks after that night, I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare. I even considered moving out of the house, but something kept me there, as if the house wouldn't let me leave. Strange things started happening after that night. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and I could hear faint whispers coming from the basement even when the door was locked. One night, I woke up to find the basement door wide open, the air in the house freezing cold. I hadn't unlocked it, hadn't touched it since that night. But something or someone had opened it for me. I moved out after that. Sold the house to a young couple. Never told them about what had happened. Part of me feels guilty, but another part of me knows it doesn't matter. Whatever is down there, it isn't tied to me, it's tied to the house, and sooner or later they'll open the door too. They'll hear the whispers. and they'll wish, just like I do, that they had never unlocked that basement door. My name is Lucas Hoffman, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I was 29 when this incident happened to me. I was traveling from Phoenix to Jerome, a historic mining town turned tourist destination nestled in the Black Hills. I had heard about the town's rich history of copper mining and its transformation into a haven for artists and wanderers. What I wasn't prepared for was the darker side of Jerome, the side that the brochures didn't mention, the side that kept me up at night long after I returned home. It all started when my friend Jake, a history buff, convinced me to take a weekend trip to Jerome. "It's a quirky little place, man," he had said. "Old buildings, haunted hotels, a ghost town feel. You'll love it." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I've always been skeptical when it comes to ghost stories and paranormal sightings. To me, they were just exaggerated tales told by people looking to spook others for fun. But after what I experienced in that old mining town, I'm not so sure anymore. We arrived late in the afternoon on a Friday. The town was quiet, almost too quiet for my liking. Jerome wasn't big, just a collection of old brick buildings clinging to the mountainside, with narrow streets winding up through the hills. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the town, and I remember feeling a strange sense of isolation as we pulled up to the small inn where we had booked a room. The streets were empty, save for a few stray tourists and shop owners closing up for the night. Jake, of course, was thrilled. He couldn't wait to explore the town and check out all the haunted locations he'd read about online. Me? I was more interested in grabbing a drink and unwinding after the drive, but Jake insisted we start with a visit to the old mining district on the outskirts of town. "You've got to see it before it gets too dark," he said. We headed out, taking a narrow, dusty road that led away from the town center and toward the abandoned mining structures that had once been the lifeblood of Jerome. The sun was almost gone by then, and the landscape around us felt eerie, silent, barren, with nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the empty buildings. The air was thick with the scent of dust and rusted metal. I could see the remains of mining equipment scattered around the area, long abandoned, left to decay in the Arizona heat. We made our way to the largest structure, an old mine shaft entrance that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wooden beams supporting the entrance were weathered and cracked, and a padlocked gate barred anyone from entering the dark tunnel beyond. Jake was snapping pictures, excitedly talking about the history of the mine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air around the mine felt heavy, oppressive. It was as if the ground itself was trying to warn us to stay away. And then I heard it, a faint sound, like distant footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper within the abandoned district. I turned to Jake, but he was too absorbed in his camera to notice. The sound grew louder, closer, as if someone, or something, was walking toward us from the shadows. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. Just the two of us standing in the fading light, surrounded by the crumbling remains of the old mining town. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice betraying the unease I was trying to hide. Jake stopped, lowering his camera. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," I said, scanning the area. "I swear I heard someone walking." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Dude, it's probably just the wind or some animal. Relax. You're letting the creepy atmosphere get to you." But I wasn't convinced. The footsteps had sounded too deliberate, too human. I suggested we head back to the inn, but Jake insisted on checking out one more spot, the old miners' boarding house. It was just a short walk from where we stood, and he promised we'd be quick. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The boarding house was a large, two-story building that had once housed dozens of miners during Jerome's boom years. Now it was just a dilapidated shell of its former self, the windows boarded up, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. We approached the front door, which was hanging off its hinges, and cautiously stepped inside. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with debris. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the floorboards creaked with every step we took. I could feel the temperature drop as soon as we entered, and a strange chill settled over me, sending shivers down my spine. Jake, ever the fearless explorer, moved deeper into the house, snapping photos and commenting on the historical significance of the place. But I wasn't paying attention anymore. My focus was on the sounds. At first it was faint, just a soft whisper, like the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. But then it grew louder, more distinct. Voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were there, echoing through the empty halls of the boarding house. I called out to Jake, but he was already in another room, out of earshot. I was alone. And that's when I saw him. Standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, was a man. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, like something out of a history book. His face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes were hollow, empty. He just stood there, staring at me, unmoving. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mouth went dry. I wanted to call out to Jake, but no sound came out. The man didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there watching me. And then, without warning, he vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Had I just seen a ghost? No, that couldn't be. Ghosts weren't real. But then, what had I just witnessed? My rational mind was struggling to make sense of it, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. I wasn't alone in that old boarding house. Something else was there, something that didn't belong in this world. I rushed out of the house, calling for Jake. When I found him, he could see the panic on my face. "What's wrong?" he asked, concerned. "We need to leave. Now," I said, my voice shaking. Jake didn't argue. Maybe it was the look in my eyes, or maybe he had started to feel the same sense of unease that I had. Either way, we left the mining district and returned to the inn. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old inn, every gust of wind outside, had me on edge. I kept thinking about that man, his hollow eyes, the way he had just vanished into thin air. And the voices, the whispers, they hadn't been in my head. They had been real. The next morning, Jake was eager to explore more of the town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told him I wasn't feeling well and suggested we leave early. He was disappointed, but he agreed. As we drove out of Jerome, I glanced back at the town, its old buildings clinging to the mountainside like they had been frozen in time. A part of me was relieved to be leaving, but another part of me knew that whatever haunted those old streets and buildings hadn't let go of me yet. It's been months since that trip, and I still can't explain what I saw in that old mining town. I haven't told anyone, except you, about the man I saw or the voices I heard. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying in bed, I can still hear them. The whispers, faint but persistent, like they're trying to reach me from across the veil. Maybe Jerome really is haunted. Or maybe it's something more than just ghosts. Whatever it is, I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back. My name is Marcus Whitaker, and I live in Chicago, Illinois. I was 35 when this incident happened to me. I was traveling from my apartment in the city to my family's old cabin in the small town of Willow Creek, Wisconsin. I hadn't been back there in years, probably since I was a teenager. The cabin had been passed down through the family for generations, but ever since my grandfather died, no one really had the time or desire to go anymore. Still, I figured a weekend alone in the middle of the woods would help me clear my head after a rough couple of months at work. The drive was long, but uneventful. As the cityscape faded into rural fields and dense forests, I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Willow Creek was about as remote as you could get without completely falling off the grid. It wasn't even marked on most maps, just a few scattered houses and a small general store where the locals got their supplies. The cabin itself was even more isolated, a few miles off the main road, deep into the woods. It was old but sturdy, built back when my great-grandfather first moved to the area in the early 1900s. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I parked the car at the edge of the dirt path that led to the cabin and grabbed my bags. The air was crisp, and the forest around me was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I figured it was just the stillness of the place, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city. I didn't think much of it at the time. The cabin was just as I remembered it, small, rustic, with a single story and a wraparound porch. The roof sagged a little more than it used to, and the windows were cloudy with dirt and age, but it felt familiar. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and was immediately hit with the smell of musty wood and stale air. Everything inside was as I had left it. Dust-covered furniture, old family photos on the walls, and a fireplace that hadn't seen use in years. I spent the first hour or so airing out the cabin and unpacking my things. The quiet was comforting, but there was something about the place that felt off. It was a subtle feeling at first, just a nagging sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I chalked it up to nerves, the result of being out in the middle of nowhere with no cell reception and no neighbors for miles. That night, I lit a fire in the hearth and settled into one of the old armchairs with a book. The warmth of the flames and the crackling of the fire were soothing, and before long, I was dozing off. But just as I was about to drift into sleep, I heard something, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a tree branch against the cabin, but when I listened closer, the tapping sounded more deliberate, like someone, or something, was knocking on the wooden walls. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced across the room. The tapping continued, slow and steady, as if whatever was out there knew I was inside, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But something about the sound, the pace of it, felt wrong, too human. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out into the darkness. The forest was thick, the trees forming a wall around the cabin, and beyond the reach of the firelight, everything was pitch black. I couldn't see anything out there, no movement, no signs of life. But the tapping continued, now coming from the back of the cabin, as if whatever it was had circled around. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, my hand trembling as I turned it on and slowly made my way to the back door. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing out there, but every instinct in my body screamed for me to stay inside. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door, opened it a crack, and shined the light into the night. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the clearing behind the cabin. But there was nothing there. No sign of any animal, no footprints, nothing. The tapping had stopped. I stood there for a long moment, listening. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. I shut the door, locked it, and went back to the fire, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just the woods playing tricks on me. I'd been away from nature for so long that I wasn't used to the sounds of the forest anymore. That had to be it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I spent most of my time outside, chopping wood and exploring the area around the cabin. The sunlight helped ease my nerves, and by the afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that the strange tapping from the night before had just been the wind. I decided to take a hike along one of the old trails my grandfather used to take me on when I was a kid. It wound through the woods, up a small hill, and led to an old mine shaft that had long been abandoned. The hike was peaceful at first. The forest was quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirping of birds. But as I got closer to the mine, that feeling of unease began to creep back in. The air felt heavier, colder, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I could feel eyes on me, though I knew there was no one else for miles. When I reached the mine, I stopped to catch my breath. The entrance was sealed off with a rusty metal gate, the kind you'd expect to find at the mouth of an old mine that hadn't been used in decades. I stared at it for a moment, my mind drifting back to the stories my grandfather used to tell me about the place. He'd always warned me never to go near the mine, saying that strange things happened to people who ventured too close. I didn't believe him at the time, but now, standing in front of that dark, gaping hole in the ground, I understood what he meant. There was something about the mine that felt wrong, like it was more than just an old, abandoned tunnel, like it was hiding something. I was about to turn back when I saw him. Standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the entrance to the mine, was a figure. At first I thought it was a person, a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. But as I looked closer, I realized there was something horribly wrong with him. His face, it wasn't there. He had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin where his face should have been. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me with that blank, faceless stare. I felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak, as if his gaze, if you could call it that, had rooted me to the spot. And then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. I didn't wait to see if he would come back. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, the trees blurring past me as I sprinted back to the cabin. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? Or was there really a man out there, in the woods, with no face? When I got back to the cabin, I locked every door and window, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside had me on edge, convinced that the faceless man was out there, watching me. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. It's been years since that trip, and I haven't been back to the cabin since. I've tried to put it out of my mind, to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I can still feel his presence. The faceless man, watching, waiting, and I know that one day, he'll come for me again. They say you never forget the first time you see something impossible. I was 12 when I saw the scarecrow move. Not just a twitch or a sway in the wind, but actually move, like a person. But who would believe a kid with an overactive imagination? My family lived on the outskirts of a small rural town, the kind of place where secrets are buried under gossip, and everyone's business is everyone's business. Our farm stretched over 100 acres, mostly corn. The scarecrow had stood at the edge of the field since before I was born, its straw-stuffed arms lifted in a permanent crucifixion, wearing a torn flannel shirt and an old wide-brimmed hat that had weathered one too many storms. My father called it Old Joe. Old Joe's face was sewn from burlap, with crude stitches forming a blank, unsettling expression. There were no eyes, just black buttons that never failed to make my skin crawl when I glanced at them for too long. My older brother Danny used to tease me about being afraid of it. "It's just straw and rags, you big baby," he'd say, flicking my ear. Nothing but a scarecrow. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right about Old Joe. That summer, the crops didn't grow as they should have. It was as if the earth had turned sour. My father had cursed the weather, but even the town's old-timers were baffled by the lack of rain or the strange stench that clung to the air. The wind carried whispers through the corn, faint, almost like murmured voices. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, my parents left for town, and I was left alone on the farm. Danny was supposed to come back from a friend's house, but he hadn't returned yet. I sat on the porch, watching the dark shapes of crows descend on the fields. That's when I saw it, just a flicker in the fading light. Old Joe's head turned. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, it wasn't my imagination. The scarecrow's head had shifted, its button eyes now facing the house. A chill prickled my skin, and my heart hammered in my chest. I blinked, hoping it would return to its usual pose. But Old Joe didn't move again, just stood there, staring. I locked the doors. My hands trembled as I turned the key, and I drew the curtains tight. But curiosity gnawed at me. What if it was Danny playing a prank? He was always looking for ways to scare me. I grabbed the flashlight and ventured out, the night air thick and heavy. My breath came in shallow bursts as I crossed the yard, my shoes sinking into the soft earth. The wind rustled the corn, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. I reached the edge of the field, and there he stood, Old Joe, motionless, just as he always was. But something felt wrong. Up close, his body seemed twisted, his limbs crooked in ways they hadn't been before. I shone the flashlight on his face, half expecting him to come to life. The button eyes stared back, lifeless. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. It had to be my imagination. I turned to head back when I heard it. A low creaking sound, like wood bending under pressure. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. Slowly, I turned back toward the scarecrow. Its head had shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Then, with an unnatural jerk, its arm twitched. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the beam as it hit the ground, and I scrambled to pick it up. When I looked up, the scarecrow's arms were moving, reaching out, the stuffing crackling under the strain. I bolted. The flashlight swung wildly in my hand as I sprinted toward the house, the cold night air burning in my lungs. Behind me, I heard the faint thud of something heavy hitting the ground. I didn't look back. My legs pumped harder, carrying me toward the porch. Once inside, I slammed the door and locked it again, heart pounding in my ears. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just a stupid trick of the light. Then came the knocking. Slow, deliberate knocks against the door. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling. The knocking continued. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more knocks. Silence. I glanced out the window, pulling the curtain aside just a crack. The porch was empty. No one was there. Another knock. This time it was coming from the back of the house. My mind raced. How could anyone move that fast? My throat tightened as I crept through the kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The back door shook as the knocks grew more urgent. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. And then I heard it. The voice. A raspy whisper, low and guttural. "Let me in." My skin crawled. The voice was coming from the other side of the door, but it wasn't human. It was distorted, like the wind itself had found a way to speak. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a rusted old shovel propped by the pantry, and held it in front of me. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the voice came again, this time louder. "Let me in." I backed away, not daring to take my eyes off the door. I had no idea what to do. Call the police? No one would believe me. It was just a scarecrow after all. But I knew better. That thing outside wasn't just a scarecrow anymore. The knocking stopped, and silence filled the air once more. I stood there, frozen, gripping the shovel with white-knuckled hands. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. But nothing happened. No more knocks, no more voices. Maybe it was over. I crept to the window and peered outside. The moon cast long shadows over the fields, and I could just make out old Joe standing where he always did, his arms raised in that same eerie crucifixion pose. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long, because then I saw it. A figure. Not the scarecrow this time. Walking through the corn. It was Danny. I dropped the shovel and rushed to the door, flinging it open. My brother stood at the edge of the field, his eyes wide with terror, his clothes torn and muddy. He stumbled toward me, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's coming," he said, gasping for breath. "We have to leave. Now." Before I could ask what he meant, a low growl echoed from the field. My eyes darted toward old Joe, but it wasn't the scarecrow this time. Something else was moving through the corn, its massive shadow stretching across the ground. We didn't wait to find out what it was. Danny grabbed my arm and we ran, not stopping until we were far from the house, far from the fields. The thing in the corn, whatever it was, we never saw it again. But I knew, deep down, that it was connected to old Joe. The next morning, we told our parents what happened. They laughed it off, called it a prank, and went about their day like nothing had changed. But I knew better. We both did. Old Joe still stands in the field, his button eyes watching, waiting. I've long since left the farm, but every so often I think about him, standing there in the dark, waiting for the right moment to move again, because I know it wasn't over, not yet. You'd think by now, after all the strange things I've seen, that I wouldn't believe in curses or haunted places. But some places, they don't just hold memories. They trap them. They rot and fester, and eventually, they bleed out into the real world. That's what the old road was, a festering wound on the landscape of our small town. It started at the edge of the woods and wound its way down a steep hill before vanishing into the trees. No one in town walked down it anymore, not for years. I grew up in Dunridge, a place most people drive through without a second glance. We had our usual small-town folklore, the haunted house on Barker Street, the ghostly figure spotted by the river, the usual stuff. But the old road was different. Everyone avoided it, even the older folks who weren't afraid to chase down legends. People whispered about the disappearances, kids mostly, daring each other to go down there and not coming back. My grandfather, a man who feared nothing and no one, refused to talk about it. The one time I asked, he shook his head, muttered something about the price of meddling, and changed the subject. That made me want to know even more, but no one ever gave me a straight answer. All I knew was that no one went near that road. Ever. When I turned 16, I started hanging out with a group of kids from the neighboring town. They were the type who got a kick out of testing the boundaries, looking for trouble wherever they could find it. And one night, they decided they wanted to walk down the road. It was Steve's idea. He was the unofficial ringleader, always daring us to do the stupidest things, jump off cliffs into the quarry, sneak into old abandoned buildings, that sort of thing. But the old road? That was a different level of stupid. "You ever heard of it?" he asked, grinning as we all sat in his parents' basement, the air thick with cigarette smoke. I shrugged. "Of course. Nobody goes there, though." "That's exactly why we should," Steve said, eyes glinting. "What's the worst that could happen?" Everyone laughed, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Something about his grin made me uneasy. It felt like more than just a dare. The plan was simple. Go down the road at midnight and see who had the guts to make it to the bottom. Steve claimed it would be easy. I wasn't so sure, but peer pressure has a funny way of making you do stupid things. The night of the dare, we all met by the road's entrance. It was colder than I expected, a sharp autumn chill cutting through my jacket. The moon was nearly full, casting long, eerie shadows over the trees. There were 6 of us: Steve, me, Tyler, Lucy, Kate, and Andrew. "All right, here's how it works," Steve said, holding up a flashlight. "We all go down together. First one to chicken out buys drinks for the rest of the month." I forced a grin, pretending I wasn't already regretting every decision that had led me here. We started down the road. At first, it was just like any old dirt path. The crunch of leaves under our feet, the distant sound of crickets, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But the further we went, the quieter it got. The air felt heavier, colder, like it was pressing down on us. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. My breath came out in short, nervous bursts, but I kept walking, telling myself I wouldn't be the one to turn back. The road began to slope downward, and that's when I noticed it. The smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Rotting flesh. Like roadkill left out in the sun for too long, only it wasn't coming from one spot. It seemed to be everywhere, seeping up from the ground, clinging to the trees, saturating the air. I gagged but kept walking. Steve glanced back at us, his flashlight casting a pale beam over our faces. "Smells like something died down here," he joked, but there was an edge to his voice now. Even he wasn't as confident as he pretended to be. As we continued, something else began to change. The road itself. The dirt turned darker, almost black, like it had been soaked with something. The further we went, the worse it got, until the ground became slick and sticky, forcing us to watch every step. "I don't like this," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves. None of us did, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Steve pushed forward, leading us down the path with stubborn determination. Then, all at once, the road came to an end. We reached a clearing, where the trees parted to reveal an old stone wall crumbling and covered in vines. It stood about 6 feet high, and beyond it, the ground was sunken, like the earth had caved in on itself. In the center of the clearing, there was something, a mound of earth freshly dug. "What the hell is this?" Andrew muttered. Steve stepped closer, shining his flashlight over the mound. The light flickered, then went out. He smacked the flashlight against his hand, cursing under his breath. I felt it then, a shift in the air, a sudden drop in temperature so severe it made my teeth chatter. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. "Let's go," Kate said, her voice shaky. But Steve ignored her. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a lighter, flicking it to life. The flame illuminated the mound, casting long shadows across the clearing. And that's when I saw it. The mound wasn't just dirt. It was moving. Slowly, as if something underneath was trying to claw its way out. My heart stopped. "Steve." Before I could finish my sentence, the ground erupted. A hand, rotted, skeletal, shot up from the mound, fingers clawing at the air. Steve jumped back, dropping the lighter as the thing pulled itself free. It wasn't just a hand. It was a body. A corpse, half decayed, dressed in tattered rags, crawled out of the earth. Its skin hung in loose, sagging patches, exposing bone and muscle beneath. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth, oh God, that mouth, was twisted in an eternal scream. We all froze, too shocked, too terrified to move. Then it looked at us. "Run!" Steve yelled, breaking the spell. We scattered, sprinting back up the road, not daring to look back. The sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, pounded behind us, growing louder with each passing second. Whatever that thing was, it was fast, and it was following us. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. My only thought was to get out, to get away from that thing, to never see it again. But the road wouldn't end. No matter how far we ran, it felt like we were getting nowhere. The trees blurred together, the darkness swallowing us whole. Panic set in, my mind raced. Was the road trapping us? Was it part of the curse? Behind me, I heard a scream. I looked back and Lucy was gone. Then another scream, Andrew this time. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My legs kept moving on their own, pushing me forward, pushing me away from the horror behind me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the light. The street lights at the edge of town, faint but visible through the trees. I burst out of the woods, collapsing onto the pavement. Steve and Kate stumbled out behind me, gasping for air. But Tyler, Lucy, and Andrew were gone. We never found them. The police searched the woods, scoured every inch of that old road, but there was no trace of them. No bodies, no footprints, nothing. The road had taken them. After that night, Steve never talked about what happened. He moved away a few months later, and I don't blame him. Kate and I drifted apart, both of us too haunted by what we'd seen to ever really discuss it. As for me, I can't go near the woods anymore. Every time I pass by the old road, I feel it, the pull, the weight of those lost souls trapped down there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to walk down that cursed path. Because once you go down the old road, you don't come back.